My father built everything with his hands, not metaphorically, literally, with calloused, scarred, permanently stained hands that never fully came clean, no matter how hard he scrubbed them at the end of a shift. I used to watch him at the sink in the shop bathroom, working at his knuckles with a stiff brush and that orange mechanics soap that smelled like chemicals and citrus, and the black never completely came out. It lived in the creases of his skin like something permanent, like a tattoo he never asked for. He stopped being bothered by it sometime in his 30s. By the time I was old enough to notice, he'd accepted it the way you accept a scar. It's just part of what you look like now. He started with one shop in 1987, a concrete floor, 2 hydraulic lifts that he'd bought secondhand from a guy in Ohio who was retiring, and a sign he painted himself on a piece of plywood because he couldn't afford to hire someone to do it properly. The sign was crooked. The left side sat about 2 inches lower than the right side, and it drove people crazy. Customers would mention it. Friends would offer to fix it. His suppliers would point at it with that look people get when something small is bothering them more than they want to admit. My father always thanked them and never touched it. When I was old enough to ask him directly why he left it like that, he said it reminded him of where he started. I accepted that answer for years. It was only much later that I understood it was more complicated than that, but I'll get to that part. By the time I was 10 years old, there were 3 shops. By the time I was 18, there were 11, spread across 4 counties, with his name on every single one of them. Marcus Reedwood Auto Group. His name. His sweat. His 30 years of 6-day weeks and skipped vacations and reinvesting everything back into the business instead of buying the lake house my mother wanted, or the boat my father had always quietly wanted, but never said out loud, because there was always something more important to spend the money on. I grew up in those shops the way some kids grow up on baseball fields or in church basements or at their parents' restaurant after school. It was just where we were, where I was, while other kids were at practice or at the mall or doing whatever it was they did on Saturday afternoons. I was in Bay 3 learning how to change a tire properly, or sitting on an overturned bucket watching my father diagnose an engine problem the way a doctor diagnoses a patient, listening, feeling, eliminating possibilities one by one until only the truth remained. He had a gift for it, not just the mechanical part, though that was real too. He had a gift for patience, for not jumping to conclusions, for sitting with uncertainty long enough to actually understand it instead of just resolving it quickly and wrong. He tried to teach me that. I'd like to think some of it took. My mother was a quiet woman who loved loud music, which was one of the first things my father ever told me about her, and which I think tells you almost everything you need to know. She worked in the shop's front office for the first 8 years, answering phones, handling billing, managing the scheduling that my father was genuinely terrible at, because he always said yes to everyone and then couldn't figure out how to fit it all in. She was the one who learned to say no on his behalf, diplomatically but firmly, and it made the business run better, and it drove him slightly crazy in the way that being saved from yourself always does. They argued about it sometimes, not badly, just the kind of arguing that comes from two people who are both right about different parts of the same thing. She left the shop when I was born and didn't come back to working there, though she never really left the business. She just moved her involvement to the kitchen table, reviewing numbers at night, asking questions he hadn't thought to ask, keeping track of things in a spiral notebook she kept in the third drawer of her desk in the study. When she died, I found 17 of those notebooks going back to 1989. My father couldn't look at them for 2 years. Then one day they were on his desk at the shop, and we never talked about it. She passed when I was 14. Breast cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by October. 8 months. My father aged a decade in those 8 months, and I watched it happen, and there was nothing to do except show up every day and be present and not fall apart. Because if I fell apart, he would have had to hold me together, and he didn't have anything left for that. So I held myself together, and I went to school, and I came to the shop after, and I handed him wrenches, and we didn't talk about it much, and somehow that was enough. Or not enough, but it was what we had, and we used it. My father's younger brother, Daniel, was 12 years his junior, which meant he'd grown up watching my father scratch and claw from nothing, and had taken from that experience a lesson that was almost the opposite of the obvious one. Instead of thinking, look what's possible if you work hard and stay consistent, Daniel had concluded something more like, look what my brother has, and by extension what our family has, and therefore what I have access to if I need it. It was a subtle distinction, but it was everything. It was the difference between a man who builds and a man who positions himself near builders. Daniel wasn't a bad person in the obvious way. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't openly lazy. He had charm, real charm, the kind that makes you feel good about yourself in his presence, the kind that makes you want to believe the version of himself he's presenting. He'd had several businesses over the years, each one described with tremendous enthusiasm at the early stages, and each one ending quietly 2 or 3 years later in a phone call to my father that would result in a wire transfer and a handshake, understanding that it would get paid back when things picked up. My father never pressured him about it. He'd give the money and move on and never bring it up again because Daniel was his brother, and that was how he handled family. A failed restaurant in 2001, a real estate venture in 2008 that collapsed with the market, a consulting firm in 2013 that Daniel explained to me once at Thanksgiving in enough detail that I still couldn't tell you what it actually did. My father bailed him out each time without conditions beyond the handshake, which, in my father's world, was everything, and in a courtroom is worth exactly nothing. And I know that now, but I didn't know it then. Danielle's son Philip was 3 years older than me. He had his father's charm, but less of his father's capacity to obscure it. You could see the calculation working behind Philip's eyes in a way that Daniel had learned over decades to hide. Philip talked about business the way people talk about things they've read about extensively but never actually done. He had opinions about markets, about expansion strategies, about management structures. At family dinners, he would hold court on these subjects, and my father would nod and smile and pass the bread, and I used to interpret that nodding and smiling as polite tolerance. Later, I understood it was something else. My father knew exactly what Philip was. He was just patient about it in the way he was patient about everything, waiting to see if the man would grow into something better. My Aunt Carol was my father's sister, 10 years older, widowed, living about 40 minutes away. We saw her at the major holidays, and occasionally in between, a warm but not particularly close relationship, in the way that extended family often settles into a comfortable distance. When my mother died, Carol started coming around every Sunday. She'd bring food, casseroles, baked things, the kind of cooking that says I don't know what to say, but I wanted to show up. And she'd sit in the kitchen and talk to my father while I did homework at the table, and she'd make sure there was food in the refrigerator and that I had clean clothes for school and that my father was eating. I was grateful for it. My father was grateful for it. It felt like exactly what family is supposed to do when something terrible happens. Close ranks around the wound, fill the gaps, show up without being asked. I was 16, grieving, and completely unable to see what was already being arranged around me. I went to state school for mechanical engineering. My father had money for somewhere better by then, real money, more than either of us talked about openly, and he pushed me toward it. I'd done well enough in school that the options were real, but I'd watched him build what he'd built, and I knew the thing I most needed to learn wasn't in a more prestigious classroom, and I thought the faster I got back to him, the better for both of us and for what we were eventually going to build together. He argued with me about it across one long dinner and then dropped it permanently, which was how he handled disagreements he'd lost. Acknowledge it once, let it go, never revisit. It was a genuinely rare quality, and I've tried to develop it in myself with mixed results. I came back at 22 with an engineering degree and an amount of hunger that I didn't quite have the self-awareness to recognize at the time. My father put me to work at the third shop on the south side of town where nobody knew my last name, starting at the bottom because he didn't believe in any other way to start. And I worked there for 8 months doing oil changes and tire rotations and customer intake before moving to the next shop and the next, rotating through the organization from the ground floor up, spending time in billing and purchasing and HR and fleet management and every operational layer that held the thing together. It took 4 years. By 26, I was running operations for the whole group, and we'd started having the conversations. Careful, detailed, unhurried conversations, usually in the evening after the shops had closed, sitting in his office with coffee going cold on the desk, about what came next. The fleet contract was the thing. There was a municipal contract coming up for renewal. The county's entire fleet of service vehicles, school buses, public works equipment, city maintenance, that my father had been quietly positioned for over 20 years of showing up, doing the work correctly, and never embarrassing the people who'd trusted him. It wasn't guaranteed. Nothing in business is. But the relationship was real, and the track record was real. And if we landed it, we'd need 2 new facilities and somewhere around 80 additional employees, and the business would double in size within 3 years. that was when Daniel and Philip started showing up more. It happened gradually, which is how these things always happen when they're being managed by someone who's thought about it. Daniel called more often. He expressed interest in the fleet contract negotiations. He started asking to sit in on meetings, not demanding, just asking, framing it as wanting to understand the business better, as family pride, as a desire to finally be more involved in what his brother had built. My father was genuinely moved by it. He'd spent 30 years wishing Daniel would take more interest, and now here was his brother finally asking to be included, and my father opened the door wide because that's who he was. Philip started appearing at the shops, friendly visits, coffee in hand, asking questions that were just detailed enough to seem informed without revealing what he was actually trying to map. He'd ask about our margins on different service categories. He'd ask about the timeline on the fleet contract decision. He'd ask about our banking relationships and whether we'd looked at any outside investors for the expansion. I answered what I answered and deflected what I deflected and said nothing to my father about it because I didn't have anything concrete yet, just that feeling, that wrongness, like a weather forecast that doesn't match the sky. My father got the diagnosis in May. He'd been tired for months in a way that sleep wasn't fixing, and I'd been pushing him to go in since February, and he'd been deflecting since February in the way men of his generation deflect medical things, with humor and stubbornness and a practiced ability to not notice what they don't want to notice. When he finally went, it was because I stopped asking and started driving him there myself on a Tuesday morning and sitting in the waiting room for 2 hours until someone came out. Parkinson's disease. Early stage. The neurologist used words like manageable and progressive and quality of life in the same sentences, which is the medical vocabulary for something that will get worse at a pace we can't fully predict, but probably slower than you're afraid of right now. My father listened to all of it and asked 3 specific questions and thanked the doctor, and we walked out into the parking lot, and he said, "Well, let's get lunch." And we got lunch and talked about the fleet contract and a staffing problem at the 7th shop and didn't talk about what we'd just heard at all. And that was how he wanted it. So that was how we did it. He told Daniel that Sunday. I don't know exactly what was said because I wasn't there, but I know the timeline of what happened next because I lived inside it. Within 3 weeks of that conversation, Daniel had retained an estate attorney, not a general practitioner, a specialist, the kind of firm with a particular expertise in high-value asset restructuring, business succession, and what the legal profession calls estate planning, but which in this context meant something considerably more specific. I found the document by accident on a Wednesday afternoon in my father's office. 12 pages, preliminary, dense with the kind of language that sounds neutral to someone reading quickly and reveals itself to someone reading carefully. I read it carefully. I stood at my father's desk and read all 12 pages twice, and then I took my phone out and photographed every single one, put the document back exactly as I'd found it, walked to my car, and sat in the parking lot for a long time. What the document proposed, in the language beneath the language, was this: that in the event of my father's incapacitation or diminished capacity, control of Marcus Reedwood Auto Group would transfer to a family trust administered by a 3-person board: Daniel, Philip, and a third party to be named. My role in this structure was described as salaried general manager, which sounds reasonable until you notice that it came with no equity stake, no ownership interest, no voting rights, and a compensation structure that could be adjusted by the board at their discretion. I would run the business my father had built, and that I'd spent my entire adult life learning and expanding. I would run it for people who had never changed an oil filter in their lives, for a salary they could cut whenever they decided to, at a company where my name appeared on nothing. Daniel had not told my father about this document. That was the thing I kept returning to as I sat in that parking lot. His brother was alive. His brother was sharp. His brother was still showing up every morning, still making decisions, still the man whose name was on everything, just moving a little slower now, just with that tremor in his left hand that he thought nobody noticed. And Daniel had already commissioned a document to restructure what his brother had built, to position around him while he was still standing in the middle of it. I didn't confront anyone. That was the hardest discipline I've ever practiced. Going to Sunday dinner 4 days later and sitting across from Daniel and his practiced warmth, and Philip and his careful questions, and passing the bread and talking about the football game and the weather and a restaurant someone had been to recently, all while carrying what I knew. But I'd learned from my father that patience isn't weakness, and that moving before you're ready is how you lose things you should have kept. I called Helen Marsh on Monday morning. She was the best estate and business litigation attorney in the state. I'd done 3 weeks of research to land on her name, and when I sat across from her desk and explained the situation, she looked at the photos of Daniel's document for 20 minutes without speaking, and then looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "How much time do we have?" I said, "I don't know, early stage Parkinson's, progressive." She said, "Then we start today." What Helen explained to me over the next 2 hours was that Daniel's approach wasn't impulsive. It was patient, and it was smart, and it had probably been developing for longer than I realized. The increased involvement, the Sunday dinners, the sitting in on meetings, it was all creating a documentary record of participation, establishing Philip as a visible operational presence, building a paper trail that could later be used to argue legitimate business engagement. Against that, I had 4 years of running operations for the entire company, and almost none of it formally documented in any legally meaningful way. No partnership agreement, no letter of intent, no signed record of the succession conversations my father and I had been having for years. In my father's world, a handshake was a sacred thing. In a courtroom, it is admissible as nothing. Daniel knew this. He'd had years to think about it. He'd watched the business grow, and he'd watched his brother age, and he'd waited for the moment when the timeline shortened. And when the Parkinson's diagnosis gave him that moment, he moved. Helen filed a formal ownership and succession documentation package within 2 weeks. It was comprehensive. My equity stake, my operational authority, my succession position, supported by 4 years of payroll records, performance documentation, correspondence, and written statements from 6 long-tenured shop managers who could speak to the structure of our working relationship. My father signed everything with full legal formality, with his personal attorney present, with a statement from his neurologist confirming complete cognitive capacity at the time of execution. Before any of that happened, I had dinner with my father. Just the two of us, at the diner we'd been going to since I was a kid. Vinyl booths, coffee that had been sitting too long, pie that was better than it deserved to be given everything else about the place. I put my phone on the table with the photos of the document and slid it across to him without saying anything. He read every page. His left hand was flat on the table, and it was still, and I watched it because I couldn't watch his face the whole time. When he finished, he looked out the window for a while. The diner was half full around us, and nobody was paying any attention to us, and it felt like we were completely alone in the way you sometimes are in public places when something important is happening. He said, "How long have you had this?" I said, 3 weeks. He said, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I said, "Because I needed to understand it first, and because I knew it would hurt you, and I wanted to have something useful to say when I told you." He sat with that. He drank his coffee. Then he said, "He's my brother." I said, "I know." He said, "I gave him everything he asked for." I said, "I know that too." He looked at the window again for a long time, and then he said, "What do we do?" Not what does he do. What do we do? Still together. Still the same unit we'd been in the shop at 14 when there was nothing to say, and we just kept showing up anyway. I said, "We protect what you built, and we do it right." Daniel found out about the legal filing within days. The calls started immediately, to my father first, warm and wounded and confused, asking what was going on, saying he'd only ever wanted to help, saying he didn't understand why this was becoming adversarial. My father listened carefully and said very little. Then Daniel called me. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long and covered the full range from hurt to reasonable to subtly threatening, landing on a note of family loyalty that would have been genuinely moving if I hadn't read his 12-page document 6 times by then. I didn't call back. Philip showed up at the main shop on a Wednesday. He came into the service bay with coffee and that smooth, easy presence he'd always had, and said he thought we should talk, that there'd been a misunderstanding, that his father had only ever wanted what was best for everyone. He was good at it. If I'd been someone who didn't know what I knew, the performance would have landed. I stood in the bay in my work clothes and let him finish, and then I said, "There's nothing to talk about. The documentation has been filed. My father's wishes are on record. Everything is clear." He said, "You're making an enemy out of family." I said, "I didn't start this." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I'd seen at 100 family dinners, somewhere between offense and recalculation, the look of someone adjusting their approach rather than reconsidering their position. Then he picked up his coffee and walked out of the bay, and I watched him go and felt nothing except a kind of tired clarity. Daniel's attorney sent a challenge letter 6 weeks later, arguing undue influence, the claim being that my father's diagnosis made him susceptible to manipulation by a dependent family member, meaning me. It was a long shot, and Helen said so directly when she called. We responded with my father's neurologist's statement, his personal attorney's testimony, and a full financial accounting of Daniel's history with my father going back to 2001. Every loan, every bailout, every dollar that had been given and never returned, documented with dates and amounts going back 23 years. The challenge was withdrawn 6 weeks after that. The fleet contract came through in October, 7 years, the longest term the county had ever offered a private contractor. My father and I were in his office when the call came through, and he put the phone down and sat for a moment, and then put his hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything. And that was exactly the right thing, and we both knew it. We broke ground on the first new facility in January. The second one followed 8 months later. Construction on both ran on schedule, which in construction is practically a miracle, and which I credit entirely to our project manager, a woman named Sandra, who had an uncanny ability to make contractors afraid of her in a way that produced excellent results. My father's condition progressed the way his neurologist had said it would. Slowly, in the best possible version of a thing that only goes one direction. He went from 5 days a week to 3, then to 2, then to 1 Friday a week, then to phone calls in the morning where he'd ask me about what was happening at each shop, and listen carefully and offer opinions that were still, infuriatingly and wonderfully, usually correct. The mornings were harder than the afternoons. The stairs required more attention. His left hand moved with a tremor that was more visible now than the one he'd thought nobody noticed. But he was sharp. He was present. He was still the person I'd always known. Just slower, just more careful, just requiring more of what he'd always had in abundance, which was patience. We opened the third new facility in September of the following year. 87 employees across the new locations. My father came to the opening and walked slowly through the building and looked at everything and stood outside in front of the sign with his name on it, and I watched his face. And it was the same face I'd seen when I was 10 years old in Bay 3, learning how to change a tire. Completely present, completely full, not needing anything else from the moment. He said, "Your mother would have liked this." I said, "She would have cried." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and doesn't perform itself. I hadn't heard it in a while, and it hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Philip sent a text message about 8 months after that. His father wasn't well. There were financial difficulties. He hoped we could find a way to move past things for the sake of the family. He used the word family 4 times in 11 sentences, which I noticed because I'd started noticing things like that. I read it once and put my phone down and thought about my father laughing in front of that building. I thought about Helen Marsh saying we start today. I thought about a vinyl diner booth and bad coffee, and my father asking, "What do we do?" I wrote back 2 sentences. "I hope your father gets the help he needs. I don't have anything else for you." He didn't respond. There's a version of this story where I feel guilty about that, where I second-guess the hardness of it. Wonder if I should have left a door open. Wonder if family loyalty required something more generous from me. I've sat with that version. I've given it real consideration because I think you have to, or you become someone who doesn't examine themselves, And that's a different kind of failure. But here's what I keep coming back to. My father gave Daniel everything he asked for 3 times across 20 years, without conditions and without resentment. And Daniel took all of it and then hired an attorney to restructure his brother's life's work around him, while his brother was still alive and sharp and showing up every morning just a little slower than before. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not poor judgment in a difficult moment. That's a sustained, patient plan built on the assumption that my father's decency was a resource to be extracted. You don't owe people unlimited chances to do that to someone you love. My father is still alive. He comes in on Friday mornings, sitting in his office with the same kind of coffee mug he's been using for 40 years, asking about each shop in order, listening carefully, offering observations that cut to the center of problems I've been thinking about for a week. His mind is what it always was. His body has slowed. That's the deal, and he made peace with the deal a long time ago in a way that I'm still trying to learn from. Last Friday, he looked up from his mug and asked me if I'd ever understood why he left the sign crooked. I said I thought I did, that it reminded him of where he started. He said, "That too. But also, I left it crooked so that when people drove into the lot, the first thing they saw was something imperfect, something that didn't pretend. And I found that people trusted that. They trusted the crooked sign more than they'd have trusted a perfect one, because a perfect sign doesn't look like someone who works for a living. It looks like someone who wants to look like they work for a living, and people can feel the difference even when they can't name it." He turned his mug in his hands for a moment. He said, "I wanted them to trust us before they ever got out of the car." I've been thinking about that since Friday, about the difference between the thing and the appearance of the thing, about my father who built everything and never needed anyone to know it, and his brother who positioned himself near the thing that was built and needed everyone to believe it was partly his, about what it costs to be patient and present and consistent across 35 years, and what it costs to watch someone be all of those things and decide the lesson is that proximity is the same as participation. Marcus Reedwood Auto Group currently operates 19 locations. The county contract was renewed last spring. We're in early conversations about expansion into 2 neighboring states that I think will happen within 3 years if we're careful about it, and we will be careful about it because that's how we do things. My father's name is on every single location, on the signs and the letterhead and the fleet vehicles and the uniforms and the invoices that go out every month to every customer. His name, earned through 35 years of 6-day weeks and reinvested profits and 100 decisions that cost him something real in the short term because he was thinking about the long term. It stays there. That part was never in question.